Hello, Internet friend. Today on Value Side, Joe Biden flirts with Armageddon. How the Kursk incursion opens the door to a nuclear response. I'm David Ravel. Well, on August 6, Ukraine forces launched what is euphemistically called an incursion into Russia, an incursion that was equipped, managed, and planned by the United States and NATO forces. Most startling of all, this incursion in reality, an invasion, occurred precisely on the 79th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima, an event that marked the beginning of the nuclear era. While the weapon used at Hiroshima pales in comparison to the nuclear bombs of today, it was nonetheless so devastating that most responsible leaders have promised never to use them again. Throughout these 79 years, a central tenet evolved called MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. This concept states that neither side would initiate a nuclear confrontation because to do so would destroy both countries. Although nuclear treaties would come and go, this MAD doctrine would be followed by the two nuclear superpowers, Russia, formerly the Soviet Union, and the United States. Until, that is, Kursk. Now, regrettably, the MAD doctrine did not eliminate war completely. The later half of the 20th century and now the 21st century have seen many regional bush wars. These more minor conflicts have sometimes become an opportunity for the major nuclear powers, the U.S. and USSR, now Russian Federation, to square off against one another through their proxies in regional combatants. It's a new way of fighting that began less than 5 years after Hiroshima and the beginning of the nuclear era. The war between North and South Korea began in 1950. Supporting the North Korean proxies were both the Soviet Union and China. The Soviets supplied North Korea with munitions, medical equipment, and their top-of-the-line MiG-15 fighter jets. Although China was more visible, the Soviets were the nuclear power, having produced their first successful A-bomb the year before, on August 29, 1949. Korea became the first of what would become a continuing model of proxy wars between the two principal nuclear powers of the Soviet Union, now Russia, versus the United States. One of America's most decorated soldiers, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur, led the South Korean and UN American forces. In short, this back-and-forth conflict reached a stalemate that MacArthur wanted to break through with a decisive thrust into North Korean territory, something that Washington saw as much too provocative. U.S. leadership thought the risk of such an escalation would lead to another worldwide confrontation that would likely go nuclear. In the end, President Truman relieved MacArthur, and the principle of restrained regional war began. It was the MAD doctrine in action. A proxy war must not be allowed to morph into general conflicts between the two nuclear powers. Now, it should come as no surprise that one of the most adamant opponents to the current Kursk incursion has been Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. Newsweek reports that Kim's spokesman said, quote, "Washington and its allies are wholly responsible for the new Ukrainian offensive, which could spark an all-out war in Europe." It's clear that the current leader of North Korea, Kim, clearly sees the danger of escalation that he experienced back in the 1950s. Now, throughout those intervening years, a series of red lines were established to prevent any direct confrontation between the U.S. and the Russians. There were often heated debates among closed doors in Washington to determine just how far the American military might go before antagonizing its chief opponent. For years, Americans refused to mine Haiphong Harbor, the chief supply route for Soviet ships into North Vietnam. Now, in ordinary times, cutting the supply lines of America's enemy would have been job number one. However, the United States under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson refused this strategy as it might destroy Soviet ships. And it was only at the end of the war that President Nixon finally mined Haiphong, but only after sufficient warning was given at the Paris peace talks. In the Soviet Afghanistan War number 1, it has now been reported that there were extensive arguments among the Carter cabinet advisors on how far their support of the Mujahideen should go. President Carter established the American strategy, which conformed to stringent constraints that would eliminate confrontation between the two nuclear powers. So America's support was limited to supplying arms and providing American advisors. This constraint was observed even under President Reagan, who came to office with the reputation of an Uberhawk. Russia returned the favor, quote unquote, by also restraining its support of the Taliban during the American incursion that ended in November of 2022. Although the specific red lines sometimes changed, as when the U.S. finally mined Haiphong Harbor, one thing remained inviolable. The two nuclear superpowers must never directly confront one another. That is, until the Kursk incursion. The best description of where we find ourselves today was provided by the United States President, Joseph R. Biden, just 5 months after the Ukraine war began. Speaking before the DNC Senatorial Election Campaign Committee, Biden said, and I quote, "Let me put it this way. Think about it. We have not faced the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. We've got to know that guy fairly well. His name is Vladimir Putin. I spent a fair amount of time with him. He's not joking when he talks about the potential use of tactical and nuclear weapons, or biological or chemical weapons, because his military is, you might say, significantly underperforming. It's part of the Russian doctrine that they will not, if the motherland is threatened, they'll use whatever force they need, including nuclear weapons." Biden goes on to say, "I don't think there's any such thing as an ability to easily loose a tactical nuclear weapon and not end up in Armageddon." Unquote. If the motherland is threatened, they'll use whatever force they need, including nuclear weapons. Joe Biden. Although some may quibble with Biden's characterization of the Russians' military performance in Ukraine, there can be little doubt that he's right in assessing Russians' ability and willingness to use nuclear weapons. As this is written, it's being reported that Ukraine has launched its most significant drone attack on Moscow to date. By land and air, NATO, Ukraine, and the United States are deep into Russia's motherland. And that's today's Value Side. For all of our articles, references, and podcasts, visit valueside.com. I'm David Ravel. ValueSide is independently written and researched. The views expressed are strictly my own.